There, I'm Dr. David Riley, and today I'll be presenting a series of online mini-lectures on survey design and analysis. Just so you know who you are, if I haven't taught you before, here's a little selfie of me, but as I'm rather camera shy, I'm going to put that away rather quickly. Okay. Alright, so first lecture is just an overview of what we'll be doing. So these online lectures are designed to be self-paced and supplemented by readings. Now by self-paced, rather than the traditional, 2-3 hour lecture, gets very boring, students don't retain a lot, you can just hit pause, you can go grab a cup of coffee, grab a bite to eat, and then resume. Something you don't quite understand, you can rewind. Something that perhaps is a little boring, maybe you want to fast forward. Some may choose to just watch the mini lectures as a compulsory act, but the additional readings are helpful to dip in and dip out on, depending on what your needs are for your project or for your statistics knowledge. So there'll be some assumed knowledge, but I'm not going to be teaching the very basics like what is a probability value. But because we do have students from other universities and also of varying ability levels, we do need to cover some basics as well. So things like the difference between nominal, ordinal, interval and ratio data. But if that's too basic for you, feel free to fast forward if need be. Now, I think for a lot of you, you probably already feel like you get surveys. You've done them in undergrad, you've done it in your honours. After all, it's just a bunch of Likert scales, right? But there's actually a whole wide world of other rating scales to explore, which can be useful, including in your surveys. And they may be suitable either in your work, in your general day-to-day work, either as a clinical psychologist or an organisational psychologist to gather data, or perhaps for your thesis and your research project. Now, we also need to consider the psychometric properties of the survey instruments. So while the concept of reliability is often readily understood, methods for testing validity of instruments tend to be, and I'm being charitable here, less ably understood, even at the postgraduate level. So there'll be some revision of reliability and validity of instruments, particularly in the context of surveys. Now there'll also be issues of sampling bias and sampling error to consider. Because we have less control over the internal validity of our study, when and where the survey is completed, it might be completed at home, while someone's travelling on the public transport, they may be watching Netflix in the background, hopefully not chilling, but they may not be paying attention to the survey quite as well, and there might be all this additional noise in the data. So because we have less control over external validity, we really need to pay attention to other issues that we can control, like external validity, i.e. can the survey responses generalise to the wider population? And when you're collecting data, of course you're interested in what the sample actually has to say. But as a practitioner, when you're evaluating research, you don't really care about the sample. You care about the underlying population that it's drawn from. And can this psychological research be generalised to the wider population? Now, if you've heard or read about the reproducibility crisis in psychology, and it affects all aspects from cognitive to clinical to educational, organisational, or even just general psychology, a lot of studies don't replicate. They seem to be fluke results. And one of the reasons that this happens is people don't pay a lot of attention to sampling bias. They tend to use a convenient sample, and for some types of psychological processes, a convenient sample will be okay. So if it's basic perceptual processes. But if there are known moderators, then things like age, socioeconomic status, a severity of condition, then that's really going to affect the conclusions that are drawn. It'll either serve to magnify the difference or the association or to diminish it. So this is actually poorly understood and considered by most psychological practitioners and sadly even most researchers. Why is that an issue? Well, you're going to be reading their work and perhaps basing your interventions or basing your recommendations on potentially flawed research. That's why you need to pay attention to sampling bias and external validity when you're reading such studies. So you should always read the literature broadly, and in particular meta-analyses, because these will generally identify potential moderators of the effect. And you need to be aware of those when you're reading a particular study. Is it a biased sample? And if it is, then you might want to treat it with a healthy dose of skepticism. Sampling error is another issue too. When you have a very small sample, then you're going to have larger sampling error. And that will make it harder to reject the null hypothesis, but it might also lead you to have an erroneous conclusion. Correlations in particular from small samples tend to be greatly inflated. So you should also have a thorough understanding of sampling error. One other concept that we will go through to cater for the needs of students who may be considering longitudinal designs and issues like causality, there's a lecture on longitudinal survey designs. Now you might be thinking, well, it's just a repeated measures test, right? What do I need to know? But when you're doing longitudinal designs, it's often to try to establish cause and effect. And I'm sure you've probably heard and had it drummed into your head in your first and second year stats classes that correlation does not prove causation. But if you use very clever experimental designs, you can actually bolster evidence for that cause and effect. So even if you don't think this applies to you, it's likely that you will read about studies that collect longitudinal data. So issues of causation will come up, and you need to be able to read these studies in the literature, and at least read them with some degree of skepticism. But it is stats heavy, so I would advise you to dip in and dip out as required, guilt-free. And I think for most of you, your time would be better spent paying greater attention to the earlier mini-lectures, because how you write your items, their psychometric properties or properties of survey instruments that you collect from the literature, and things like sampling bias and error, they're going to exert a greater effect on anything that you do, particularly if you're doing your research project. Okay, so I'll now start doing those mini lectures.